The Trump administration asked the U.S. Supreme Court to quickly step in to the legal battle over the president's emergency tariffs. And you probably saw this, but perhaps not. This whole move is coming after a federal appeals court ruled last week that President Trump did not have the authority to impose tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So the administration has appealed that decision, and now they are asking the Supreme Court to decide by September 10th whether or not to take the case. And the justices were also urged to schedule arguments by the first week in November. So how might all this unfold? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Spencer P. Morrison. He's editor-in-chief of the National Economics Editorial and author of Reshore: How Tariffs Will Bring Our Jobs Home and Revive the American Dream. Spencer, welcome back to Washington Watch. Appreciate you joining us.
Good evening. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so for those in our audience who may not be aware of this, can you give us kind of a brief explanation of what I just referenced, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the president's implementation of it in particular? That's the question.
Right. So just to provide a brief summary for everyone, over the last 5-6 months, there's been an enormous amount of what I would call lawfare being waged against this administration. They've been essentially taking the president to court over his use of his executive authority to institute these tariffs. And the reason for that is because, if you took your civics classes, you should be well aware, Congress has the power over the purse in accordance with the Constitution. Now, where this gets interesting is the fact that there's something called delegated authority. That is, Congress is able to pass a statute which delegates some of their decision-making authority to the president or to, the executive branch. And the reason they might do this is because, of course, people in Congress are, they take a long time to make decisions, whereas the executive is much more nimble and can respond to threats and issues. So what President Trump has done, of course, is he's taken a look at what's happened to America's economy and the downstream effects that offshoring and the so-called free trade with foreign nations have had, both on the economy and, of course, downstream socially and politically. What he said is, look, this is a total national emergency. Not only are drugs like fentanyl pouring across the border, which is killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, but on top of that, America's supply chains have been completely gutted. And this is causing a national security crisis because, of course, the military requires foreign parts in order to build machinery and equipment. Computer chips are a really good example of that. So what the president said is, look, this is a national emergency. Tariffs is a solution to this emergency. And what this litigation battle is about is whether or not this constitutes a national emergency.
Yeah, that's the huge question. So let me put wrap a couple of questions into one, if I may. First of all, how strong of a case does the Trump administration have before the Supreme Court on this? And then what are the possible outcomes that could take place, and which one do you think is most likely?
That's a good question. Well, in terms of whether or not this constitutes a national emergency, I think it depends. In terms of whether or not there's a nexus between a national emergency and tariffs, is a question that the court is going to consider. And I'm leaning to them not deeming this to be a national emergency insofar as the tariffs are instituted against Canada and Mexico. I think there's a much better case to be made with reference to China, however. Imagine if we were in the Cold War still, and the United States was purchasing, fighter jets from the Soviet Union. Can you imagine the outroar, the public outcry about the national security threat that would have? And that's essentially exactly what is happening with America's trade with China. America is purchasing almost all of the semiconductors that go into our computers from China or from Taiwan, rather than building them at home. And of course, this is a massive national emergency. That being said, I'm not confident that the court will find in the administration's favor. And this brings us to the second part of the question: where does this leave us? The reality is that there's a number of other statutes that delegate authority to the president. he could simply institute the tariffs under under another piece of delegated legislation. So I think ultimately this is really more of a roadblock than the end of the line for either the lawfare against the president or for the tariff agenda as a whole. So,
wow, so very interesting. So you're saying even if the president loses here, he still has options to continue putting forth the tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to remember that this particular piece of legislation was used to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China because of the fentanyl crisis. And then he's imposed the 10% baseline tariffs under this legislation. Now, the reality is that all of the other tariffs are actually already brought in under other legislation or under other delegated authority. So this is only going to impact a certain subset of what the president has done. So it's not the end of the tariffs by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, frankly, he could fit this in perhaps more snugly under other branches of authority to begin with.
Wow. Thank you so much, Spencer Morrison, Editor-in-Chief of the National Economics Editorial. Fascinating discussion. Deeply appreciate your input.
Thanks. God bless.